Hello, this is Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger with another California report. Now, this week, I want to discuss our budget crisis and two very different philosophies about how best to close our deficit and get our economy back on track. I believe, for instance, in lower taxes, in small government, and in helping our employers and in entrepreneurs to create jobs and to grow our revenues. And the other side believes in higher taxes, in bigger government, and protecting the public sector employees at the expense of the private sector. For example, the other side wants to raise taxes by billions and billions of dollars on income, on property, and of course on businesses and corporations. In fact, they say business and corporation as if it is a four-letter word. I think some of the legislators forgot completely that it is businesses and the taxpayers, the ordinary people out there, that generate the tax revenues that pays for their salaries. Businesses create the 60 million private sector jobs that pay for our healthcare programs, our public safety, our parks, and our schools, and the list goes on and on. Our economy would not come back, and the state revenues would not come back until the private sector and the jobs are coming back and being created. Now, higher taxes means fewer jobs. It's very simple. Also, some have suggested that business tax incentives like our tax credit for home buyers or credits for companies that hire new workers are to blame for our deficit. Now, how absurd is that? Look at the numbers. Over the last decade, changes to our tax structure have not led to a decrease in corporate revenues, but rather to an increase by $9 billion. In the meantime, salaries and benefits for our public sector employees will cost us $32 billion this year alone, up 65% from just 10 years ago, even though our revenues only went up by 24% in the last 10 years. And what is hurting California is the same thing that is hurting governments and economies all around the world. It's not just here in California. I mean, ask yourself, is it the tax incentives that are strangling Greece, France, Spain, and England and those countries? Or is it the unsustainable costs and entitlements of growing governments? As former Speaker Willie Brown has pointed out, 80% of every government dollar in California is spent on public employee compensation and benefits. So he hit the nail on the head. So for the sake of our economy and for the sake of our budget and for the sake of our children and grandchildren's future, it is those things that must be brought under control. So anyway, let me tell you a little story here about when I visited Israel just 5 years ago. I ran into and had a little meeting with then Finance Minister Netanyahu, who is now in the meantime again Prime Minister. But I asked him, I said, look, you're Finance Minister, and since you've become Finance Minister, the revenues are coming back again in Israel. The economy is coming back in a big way. Things are going really well. What's the secret? He says, I just became governor of the great state of California, and I maybe can use the same methods and the same principles. He said, the most important thing is you got to go and make government shrink, and you got to let the private sector get bigger and strong again. That's the most important. As a matter of fact, he says, let me tell you a story. When I was in the army, he says, our commander had us line up. And he said, pick each other up and then run through the finish line. And so he said, the first guy was a little guy. They had to pick up a big guy and put him on his shoulder. I weighed around 200 pounds. He says, and I had to pick up a guy also around 200 pounds and put him on my shoulder. And the guy next to him was a big, strong guy. He weighed around 220, 230, and he picked up a guy that was like 160 pounds and put him on his shoulder. And then we took off towards the finish line. And he says, let me tell you something. The first guy, the little guy, was stumbling all over, falling. He couldn't make it. He says, I moved towards the finish line with big strides. And the guy next to me, he says, who was the big guy with the little guy on top of his shoulder, he says, he ran through the finish line and he was first. So I said, well, that's a really great story. I said, well, what does it have to do with the revenues and with the economy? And he said to me, it's very simple. He says, the bottom guy represents the private sector, and the top guy represents the public sector. If the public sector is bigger than the private sector has no chance. You can't make it. That's why the first guy stumbled. That's why the other guy ran through the finish line, because he had a little guy on top. So he says, you got to make the public sector shrink. That is the bottom line. So, I wanted to tell you this because for the rest of my time while I'm governor, I can assure you that I will continue to fight with all my power to make sure that government in California lives within its means. That is the important thing, to keep it contained and not to make it go beyond so that we squish and we destroy the private sector. That is the bottom line. So anyway, thank you for watching and thank you for listening.